Well, it's 3:15 and we don't have we only have a short amount of time, so I want to go ahead and just kick us off and first by acknowledging and thanking all of the speakers for their very thoughtful presentations and for giving us all a lot of food for thought as we're thinking about our track, which is about capacity building. Just to see all of the chatter going on in Slack has been really inspiring, and it looks like we're already trading resources and information. So a big thank you to for the folks whose sessions I attended, Emma, Cassie, Eli, and Liam, and Lynn, who attended the other sessions, Lauren, Sophie, Sarah, Madhav, Will, Ilya, and Grace, Catherine, and Megan, two Catherines. So thank you all. So with that, let's just quickly recap. I'd like to invite folks to use the Slack channel to share with us some of like the best takeaways that you heard with the sessions that you were able to attend, and also as another prompt, like what didn't you hear today that you think would have been that you think you would have liked to have heard a little bit about. I'll share with me from my side before turning it over to Lynn. Always we've been dealing with a lot of trying to get caught up with accessibility best practices at the National Gallery of Art, and to just see a presentation where we were all sharing information around how to best address the issues of accessibility, not just from a technical standpoint, not just from a true accessibility and service to the public standpoint, but also just in all the ways, philosophical and practical. Really great to see that exchange of ideas. So I'm very thankful for that as a participant. And Lynn and I were just chatting real quickly before you all joined, about one thing that's in a track that has a lot to do with finance and business models. I'm fortunate enough to work at a federally funded museum. It is very much a position of privilege. And during this last year, I want to acknowledge that a lot of other museums in the US are really hurting in a way that we weren't. But I'm always interested in saying, well, it's not like we don't care about the money, and how could we, one of the things I would like to talk about in future is, how can we be held accountable for how we use the resources that are bestowed upon us, especially taxpayer money. It's your money too, right? And how can we do better as a business when we are not necessarily beholden to shareholders, but to the American public? So that's for me, but I welcome you all to add your thoughts in Slack. And Lynn, what do you think?
Well, Martin, I always enjoy, you are always so transparent about your thought, and you just make it very like a safe place or brave place for us to talk about our thought. But I first want to invite the speaker, if you can show us the emoji, just like the people know actually you are in the crowd, because I know so many people actually join us. You can raise your hand, you can send us the emoji. Yes, Cassie, Grace, Kat. Oh, Lauren, yeah, we have a really great crowd, as you can see. Oh, Max, Catherine, yeah, thank you so much. So this is really an opportunity for us to come together to process our thought together. So I do want to make some space for Martin's comments on the accessibility. I would like to stay in that topic for a little bit, because I saw there's so many people on the Slack actually ask the alt text. So is there anyone want to continue that conversation? And this is the space for you. Any questions for Cassie? And sorry, who is another presenter? I don't think I see her.
Emma was my co-presenter.
Oh, hi.
Here.
Oh yeah, hi Emma. Yes, okay. Any question? Because I saw there's a lot of question and reaction to the alt text.
Emma, do you want to add anything? Do you want me to jump in?
Yeah, Cassie, why don't you start? I mean, I feel like Cassie really was the driving force for us. I think before she joined our staff, we were certainly interested and wanted to do it, but she was really the person who joined our staff and was like, yeah, we're going to do this and let's figure out how. So Cassie, if you could talk about even just that like starting process for us, at least for me, that was really interesting.
Yeah, so some of the questions that we got were about in direct messages and in the chat were about that staff buy-in and how how to get that initial commitment from your staff to do something that, if you've never done it before, and especially if you're not someone who personally either has a disability or knows someone has a close relationship with someone who does, it can be really easy to ignore how prevalent the need for accessibility work is. And so when I came onto the staff, I had a lot of the same questions that the people are asking now in the Slack, which were, how do you convince the curators to contribute to this when they have so many other things that are a higher priority to them? How do you hold up a project from launching until the accessibility is met? If everything else is ready to go, do you say that you're not going to launch unless you meet that accessibility guideline that you set out? And for us, that was a little bit of an uphill battle at first, because I was pretty hard line about it. I was not necessarily the most fun in meetings at that point, because I didn't want to launch until we had what we needed. And I didn't want to compromise on the fact that every department had to contribute to this effort, that it wasn't going to fall just on the education team or the interpretation team, or God forbid me, because I am not gonna write the accessible text for anything. And so, I think that it was challenging at first, but ultimately it was really rewarding, because I think that we've come out of it with our staff having a greater understanding of what accessibility means. And even though we don't always get it right, and we don't always plan for it the way that I wish we did in hindsight, people are now starting to be prepared to ask the right questions, and know, when they're starting to recognize their own blind spots in regards to accessibility. And I, myself as well, I've learned a lot working in an art museum about the specific use cases of accessibility for us. If anyone wants to talk about time-based media accessibility, please message me, because I have so many questions to be answered. But so I will stop, because otherwise I could continue. But
Hsieh also did, I will say, just in terms of like, if any institution is interested in doing this and kind of keeping it up, Cassie did kind of right when we were starting to kind of intensely work on collections online, Cassie did about an hour-long session for our staff that she did it on Zoom. She recorded it so it could go out to everyone afterwards, where she talked through not really the standards for alt text, but like, why did this matter, right? Like, why was this important to people? How were people going to use it? And I think for a lot of our staff that didn't really know what alt text was, they didn't personally use it. Like Cassie said, they didn't know someone close to them who personally used it. Having her just talk through why this was so important to people and so necessary as part of our mission really helped with that early buy-in, because people just didn't know what it was or why we needed it.
Thank you. And anyone from the audience would like to respond to that? Or, oh yes, Catherine, please. I think you're raising your hand.
A different topic and not part of our survey, but one of the things that I noticed anecdotally from the Harvard Art Museums as well as the Worcester Art Museum was the connection that educators made with marketing and communications, and how well that worked in the two museums that I mentioned. I'd love to hear about if and how it worked for anyone else. Maybe not a question you want to talk about. That's fine.
Could someone summarize what was said in that session in reference to the question that you're asking?
We didn't talk about it in our session. It's just an observation that I made during the whole time that museums were locked down. The Harvard Art Museums had ready content because they had digitized during an earlier renovation. So they could, their pivot was a lot quicker than some. But at the Worcester Art Museum, they had a very good connection between audience engagement, curatorial, and marketing and communications. that allowed them to bring content online in a way that was both fun and engaging. But thank you for your question, Sarah.
Well, Catherine, to respond to your question about this collaboration between departments, actually, I learned a lot from Lauren and Sarah's presentation on how they actually, I think that's heroic action, is that to bring publication and digital department together. So I think perhaps Lauren and Sarah, you can share, because not everyone attend your session, and you give such a great presentation about the processes, the system, and how you strategically actually reuse your content. And so you don't have to keep producing it. So would Sarah or Lauren like to share your experience on how to build up the capacity?
Yeah, I mean, I can start, but yeah, the question that you just asked, Catherine, really made me think, because a lot of our presentation was about collaborations between departments. And it's very interesting to think that despite the fact that we were all so far away from each other, and in certain ways, collaborating across the museum started to feel like a much more lonely prospect. During the pandemic, we actually forged some really great relationships and new relationships that allowed us to produce digital content. So I work in the publishing department at the Art Institute of Chicago, and we've been producing digital publications for a while, since 2014, but we recently decided to switch platforms from the sort of side but this platform that we were producing digital catalogs on to using our own website, which meant that we were really in close collaboration with our digital experience department, not for the first time, but in a new way that was really productive. But it's funny that you're talking about the marketing and communications departments, because we've tried working with marketing and communications a number of times. And I think it's one thing that you need when you're working across departments is that you need a sort of common goal. And I think that for many of our projects with marketing and communications, we haven't quite found that yet, but we have found that in these digital publishing projects, because our digital experience department really wanted to have new tools and build capacity for our website in a way that was going to be sustainable, and to make use of the content that we had, new content that we were producing. And on the publishing side of things, we wanted new platforms and new places to put this content out that were going to be sustainable. So we had these goals that came together. I think often when we talk to marketing and communications, there's an issue of audience, where they see the slightly more scholarly audience that we talk to as not really having a ton of overlap with what they see as the museum goer or the paying audience. And that's still, I think, a hurdle that we have to cross in figuring out how to promote and distribute the things that we're building. But I don't know, from the Met's perspective, and Sarah, what this spoke to for you, based on her presentation or whatever else.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think we didn't have time to get into, I think, a lot of what I think are interesting facets to this overall project that had so many parallel tracks. And one of them is that the Met is one of these institutions that's known for making a lot of really incredible microsites, and we have years of microsites that have accumulated, and timeline of art history is probably the one that most people are familiar with, because it's been around since before Wikipedia, but there are many others: 82nd and 5th, Connections, the Artist Project, Viewpoints, etc. And those are sort of digital publications, right? We called them microsites at the time, but they go deep on a certain subject or kind of take a certain angle or a point of view, and they're beautiful. But when there's no marketing or promotion or distribution strategy for those pieces, they really languish, and the longer they live, the more technical debt you accumulate. And so it becomes these beautiful walled gardens just become that. You can't get anyone into them, and they're to carry on the gardening thing, you can't even get the gardeners in there to weed the gardens because the whole thing will fall apart, technically speaking. So pardon the metaphor. So when things shut down, when the museum shut down because of COVID-19, we immediately flipped a lot of the promotional spaces on our website, particularly the homepage, to direct people to these assets, and we had great engagement with them. So we know that the content is still valuable. The problem that we need to solve is the discovery of the content and the onward journeys for users who are coming. And I think, that we got a lot of buy-in from staff who wanted to help us solve that problem, because a lot of the content that's there has been written by these folks. So I think, we're still trying to solve some of the marketing and distribution pieces to this puzzle. I think that's going to take more of our focus as we move forward. Right now, we're really working on getting the system to a place where the taxonomy is really robust, that the system can support itself. It's bringing it into all of our systems, our technical stack that we're currently supporting, so that we don't have so many products that are dispersed. It also included kind of decentralizing areas of the website so that we're not the only content managers providing governance on the content of our site. So, and one of the bigger endeavors that's just started is trying to kind of find commonalities when speaking about audiences across all departments at the Met, including visitor services, membership, Marcoms, education, and we all have different communities. So that is no small endeavor. I don't know that we will, because we're working at such a big scale, I don't know that we'll crack that nut, but we're going to try. So yeah, thanks for that question. I love talking about this stuff.
I think Cassie actually have a question for you, Sarah. Cassie, would you like to ask, or I can also read your question?
Oh, yes, I did have a question, which was about what is the approach to sort of sunsetting those projects? Because Emma and I, talked briefly about when I came on board, we also had a lot of microsites. And one of the first things I said was, this is not sustainable in our extremely tiny staff. But the Met, even though you've got a huge staff, you also got a huge volume of these microsites. So what is the strategy for sort of giving those the attention that they need when you can, and then deciding when it's no longer worth the investment, even if it might be really valuable for somebody's one art history class that they are teaching somewhere in the world?
Well, we do a ton of, let me change my phrasing here. We talk about prioritization a lot. The actual work of prioritizing is super duper hard. And, I think there are certain microsites that we are maintaining and just really trying not to break. Met Kids is one of those sites. We saw our traffic for family audiences and youth audiences absolutely skyrocket in the wake of all the closures. Makes total sense because schools weren't open and parents were at home trying to homeschool their kids. And the Met is fortunate to have a lot of brand equity as a trusted resource for this type of content and these types of resources. So that is one microsite that we are just trying not to break and trying to figure out a strategy for migrating the content and representing it within some kind of a system. It's with that audience in particular. There you do need some boundaries around these spaces, because kids content has a particular need. Timeline of art history, that was one of the first things that we migrated over into our main system, and we've taken it bit by bit. We first migrated over the essays. We decided not to migrate the objects themselves because we have an online collection. So we kind of rerouted traffic to incorporate the online collection in a user journey, which has kind of an exponential benefit because we get so much traffic to our online collection. So it's kind of reinforcing the traffic between these two offerings. But things like chronologies hasn't been brought over yet because we're just not seeing the traffic. And that can be kind of a double-edged sword, right? Like if you're not doing anything to promote it or send traffic to these spaces, of course, you're not going to see the viewer numbers on those places. So it's very easy to say, well, we can cut that limb off because it's not getting the traffic that the other spaces are. So it just takes a really thoughtful approach. Artist Project is one of the next ones that's coming over into perspectives. We're actively doing that right now because it's such a beautiful, well-loved, and still very relevant series. And we're kind of taking them one at a time. We're trying to make sure that what we have is been archived and preserved digitally. We have had a digital archivist who was on a fellowship for a while who's doing that work. And we're trying not to lose any of the content. The framework, the software, we're going to lose that most likely, but the content itself we're trying to bring over into these other ecosystems. Great question.
Yes, Kate, please. Kate, please.
Hi, yes. I had a question that I was a speaker for the education program during COVID-19 lockdown, along with Catherine Burton-Jones. And since this is a sustainability sort of forum, and our research looked at mostly small to mid-sized museums, what we found was that most people were charging, if they were charging anything at all, it was between $5 to $10. And something we didn't really get to in our session was, how do we make this sustainable for these smaller institutions? And really, what are we losing if these institutions can't sustain digital? And I'm curious to hear people's thoughts on that, or recommendations, or what they experienced or did.
You definitely read my mind, Kate. I really want to spend some time on that topic, because not only your research, and also I think perhaps Megan's research about the revenue generations, I think that would be interesting for this group to talk about how our museum generate revenues through education programs, publications, other more alternative way to do it. So anyone beside the speaker and in the audience would like to share their thoughts, we would love to hear from you.
I was thinking about this in terms, as I often do, in terms of how museums and performing arts organizations exist, and this thought. I mean, I know historically museums and their education departments, what you're charging for registration for programs and stuff is just pales in comparison on the bottom line to what you're getting for tickets and things like that, right? But I wonder about this because you're talking about $5 to $10, right? Well, at least in the New York performing arts scene, right? Your off-Broadway shows are $35. Your Broadway shows are $100 for a ticket, right? And there are many situations where I don't necessarily see that what the museum is offering or has created is any less valuable than a performance. Not to like cast aspersions at performances, another thing that has to go into that, right? But the the staff involved and the time that's spent, surely couldn't there be a case made that the price point should be something higher, right? Um, and because I don't think people won't pay for it.
Max, that's come up in some of the conversations I've been having with education staff members. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm a professor at the University of Florida doing research on museum education, but I spent a decade as a museum educator prior to making the shift. And some of the conversations we've been having a lot lately has been about the valuation of education, period. And the just cascade of impacts we've had on loss of staff, but also that people don't want to pay for education materials because they feel like it should just be available. And so a lot of the museums that I talked to are really struggling with whether they could or should charge for their programs. And a lot of them had a lot of pushback from their, the higher ups in their organizations about starting these programs because there was concern about whether they would be able to drive revenue and if it was worth paying staff to do it because they were seeing it as a loss. And so there really has been a lot of conversation that there's a wide range of institutional broadly issues and cultural issues around the value of education.
I just want to say thank you for those responses and also highlight something that Cassie said in the chat that I think is important, that museums are also, you want to make it inclusive, and people who are at or below the poverty line still need to have access to these places. They're not, this sort of place where we don't want everyone to be, because we do want everyone to be there. So thank you, Cassie, for bringing up that point.
May I invite is your name Jack? Sorry if I didn't pronounce your name right. I think you have a great comment on the creator economy. If you feel comfortable, would you like to elaborate on that?
Well, I think it's the way that we package our content. I think it's the perception of the way museums present themselves. People pay for, I think we perhaps aren't in the content creation game. When people perceive museums, it's more of a transactional thing. When they buy a membership, they're buying it because they want to know what the upcoming exhibitions are. Will I get my value for what I'm paying for? But I mean, things like the Barnes Foundation, and the success that they've had with their courses, their online courses, people pay for content. They will. And then the fact that the masterclass and just the boom and all of these individual courses and skill sets and skill shares and things like that have surfaced just within the last year illustrates that people will pay for stuff. People will buy your content. I'm not quite sure. I haven't given enough thought to it in terms of how we as museums succeed with it, with trying to compete in that realm. I think there was somebody had said earlier, I think it's the perception, it's the way that we treat ourselves. Like people expect us to be free, expect us to be accessible, and we don't think like corporations. We tend to think like nonprofits, but the thing is the myth is, as a nonprofit, we can be profitable still. I think it's just, more thought needs to be given in how this stuff is packaged and selling the idea of the value that you're getting. That's the key thing. People will pay for something. And that's just what I mean, like transactions through customers is just one way of funding these types of activities. I mean, I think sponsorships and partnerships and stuff can which is what we're familiar with. at least from my institution, we have never looked at content as a means of producing income. And I think that this past year has changed that for us a little bit. We now recognize that, hey, is there a way that we can fund these projects and be a content? I mean, like from day one for me, I was always content, but that's because I come from a digital world. For everybody else, it was membership attendance coming to the venue. And I think that was a big shift that we're leaning into now, is what can content do for us?
Thank you. That's very thoughtful. And I think Sarah has something to say.
I'm going to argue with my buddy, Jacques. I linked in the chat to a study that I referenced just very briefly in my presentation today, and many of you will probably be familiar with it. It's the LaPlaca-Cohen survey that they were doing with Slover Lynette, where the actual report's going to come out in 2 waves, because they were working on the first wave when the pandemic hit and the shutdowns happened. So it is a really timely look at what audience behavior is like when physical visits to a museum are not possible. And one of the conclusions in that, or one of the key findings in that study is that when the barriers to entry for museums and other cultural endeavors are lowered democratically, there is more participation from a more diverse audience. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. And I think the nut that I want to crack is not how do I become successful at monetizing my content, and more about how do I understand the value of this content to the broadest community possible. We are, yes, 501c3 status is a tax exemption. We're nonprofit, doesn't mean for no money. But I do think that engaging in kind of very capitalist pursuits is maybe not a great direction for museums to go. We do have other funding structures and other levers to pull. And so I think for me, I'm interested in what the researchers in this call are doing to understand the value of the content that we are providing, how we can place our content into communities in a larger scale than is possible by smaller. I have the marketing power of the Met behind the content I produce, which is insane. I have worked at small and mid-sized museums most of my career, but even at the Met, it's hard to get the content placed in front of audiences that find value in it. So I think it is about value, but I don't think it's necessarily about monetization.
And I would agree with you, Sarah. I think the point that I'm arguing is that we can't write off and say we can't monetize any of our content. I think what we can do is there's probably ways in which you can incentivize membership by having exclusive access to certain content, but it's not like let's put up a paywall for everything that we do. I wouldn't argue that. That's not at all. I think it defeats the purpose of what a lot of our missions, statements say, and so access is key. I think the argument that I would make is that there are times when we could add value to a membership, which somebody is already paying for, and it not be through something that's just purely transactional, that it's not about an attendance, that it could be about the content that they're getting, the class that they're able to go to and now gain a skill, about access to a community that they, if they're another artist. I work at an art museum, so if they're a fellow artist, they pay for a membership level that gives them access to a community that they then can be a part of. And then that content you can put content into that community, where they're learning or doing something from another artist and they're gaining a skill. I think that's the kind of thing that I'm looking for. partnering up with some of the people that are taking on the risk of becoming part of this creator economy, finding those influencers and individuals that want to be independently successful, and partnering with them so that we're not always creating the content, but we have now a partnership with somebody who is taking that on. I think it's about creative thinking without compromising, exactly, Sarah, without compromising some of the core values of our mission, which is access. So.
I love you, Jacques. I was also typing this in the chat, so I'm just going to say it out loud because it's faster and I can't talk and think and type at the same time. But Tim's comment about Clubhouse and podcasting, I think, is really valuable to unpack. But I'm somebody who's really concerned about data privacy and adopting tools we don't understand. Who's the product in them? Well, I think at this point we know we're the product, right? So I wanted to uplift Tim's comment, but also throw out to this group, like, how do we solve the larger problem of surveillance capitalism and data privacy? Because there's major data privacy issues with Clubhouse, right? Like, if you were in anyone's contacts who signed up for a Clubhouse account, they made a ghost of you, and probably many sites operate that way. Yeah, Tim.
Kia ora, and good morning from Aotearoa. Sorry, I threw that in, and I absolutely appreciate the data privacy and some of the other pieces in there. I guess I've just been really interested in my space where I guess in terms of my project, I'm across a lot of different conversations that are going in terms of Pacific cultural heritage, and just seeing how things like Clubhouse or people using IG Reels to tell stories, or YouTube channels. I think there's a really fascinating space in which digital has enabled Indigenous people to be telling their story and to share their story. And I think, to the point of data privacy and digital, I totally appreciate it, because that's the space we work in. I'm based at the National Library of New Zealand, but I'm really fascinated by the people groups I'm across don't have any other tools, don't have any other platforms. And the really powerful piece I have is, in my role, is to be, and I talked about this in my talk last week, the project we're leading is a really fascinating bridge between the worlds that you're all in, these institutions that have thousands of records, and Pacific people that really critically don't know you have these records. The line I gave in my talk is that Opeta Aliafaio, who's one of our advocates from National Archives of Fiji, he said, it's one thing for your culture to be taken away from you, and Pacific people know that. It's another thing entirely to not know that your culture exists somewhere else in a warehouse. And so I guess that comment around the rise of digital across the Pacific is they don't know the stuff exists. They don't know, and I don't know if Cassie and Emma are still here, but they don't know, for example, that the University of Indiana holds 2,000 items. So they're just leaning into just telling stories and connecting in their own ways. And I think there's a really fascinating opportunity for, I think, the GLAM sector to meet people where they are, but also for people to understand, the context of what all this digital, exactly what you said, Sarah, we are the product. But I guess I'm always come back to, at the moment, there's a large chunks of the global population that don't have any other tools and whose stories are not being told. So yeah, sorry, I'll stop there.
It's a really amazing point, and it's really interesting to think about how we can use how we can tell stories across museums, because I think that part of what is really interesting about sharing some of these projects is thinking about interoperability and the way in which our projects can speak to each other and create this sort of network of tools and knowledge. So I'm just thinking about the project that we presented on is a journal that for which almost all of the authors at this point are actually not are not Art Institute staff, or we have an open call for papers, and we're trying to make a commitment to a sort of digital humanities practice where contributions can come in many different forms, and we make an effort to have creative contributions as well as written contributions, videos, etc. And our next issue is on data, and some of the projects that have been proposed are fascinating in their sort of range of types of storytelling with data. But a lot of them just look at collections and look at like ways of communicating collections, thinking about provenance, thinking about how information in collections does get sort of siloed and packed away. And so your comments are just making me think about how important it is to tackle some of those issues and think about how we can look at collections across different museums and create different points of entry. So I just appreciate your comment and look forward to creating more solutions to attacking that problem.
No, we only have a few minutes left, but I wanted to invite folks, for just because we're done with the track for today doesn't mean that we're done having these conversations. Are there any parting thoughts or any issues that you would like to see covered in future MCN areas? Feel free to speak up here or also to add your comments in our Slack channel.
Yeah, and I also want to second that. Thank you. I was a little bit nervous when I come into the recap session because I just cannot stand all the awkward silence, but you have been an awesome group. So I would like to invite everyone to 4 o'clock. There is a networking session, and I would like to end this session. Any final thoughts? If not, I will end the session. Okay. I would like to end this session with a quote from Yoko Ono. She says, "A dream you dream alone is only a dream, but a dream you dream together is a reality." I think we have so many people are like-minded here. So hopefully one day this will be a reality for us. So thank you very much. I hope you have a great day. Good afternoon, good night, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you.